Glory of the coming of the time, when God riding love shall light shall make our lands fine, when mountain, hill, and rock and rill with freedom's light will shine, as truth comes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The truth is marching on. They saw it in the shadows of the old New England bay. They heard it in the breezes of that holy Sabbath day. They sent it with the echoes to recant far away. That truth was marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The truth is marching on. They saw it in the shadows of the old New England bay. They heard it in the breezes of that holy Sabbath day. They sent it with the echoes to recant far away. That truth was marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Good morning, everyone, and we would like to thank the Berks History Center for an opportunity to come on their second Saturday program to kick off, like Ben said, National Women's History Month and the Centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment. Well, from the earliest years of our history, women have played pivotal roles in creating, expanding, and sustaining the spirit of American democracy. They spoke in many voices and supported many causes, but their courageous actions make up an exciting and inspiring part of our common heritage. As you all know, women in the United States weren't able to vote until the 19th Amendment was certified on August 26, 1920. To win that right, suffragists waged a 72-year campaign of intense organizing, lobbying, petitioning, and direct action that challenged many of the most basic assumptions about women at that time. Yet it was essential to bringing the principle of American democracy to fruition. Rather than taking up arms to win their civil and political rights, women met together. They talked and organized. They mounted educational drives and electoral campaigns. They took action. In every way, they worked with what they had within the democratic experiment that was underway and welcomed all who shared their love of America's promise. Few groups worked harder within a democracy for fundamental democratic change than American suffragists. And by the way, the American women did not want to be called suffragettes like their English counterparts. It had to do with the suffix "ette" on the end of the word. If you look it up in your dictionary, it'll say small or unimportant. So now you know why they chose to become suffragists. Also today, you'll see all of our suffragists wearing yellow rosebuds. When the battle for state ratification began, those people wearing yellow rosebuds were for women's suffrage, and those that were against it wore red rosebuds, kind of a war of the roses. Well, for 7 decades, they demanded equal rights for women, from the male voters and the political leaders who held the power. Women viewed democracy from the outside and most like what they saw. There was public participation, free elections, open discourse, and majority rule. They wanted to be part of it and saw no reason why they shouldn't be. Excluded from the male political parties and institutions of government, women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries gathered under outstanding women leaders that they freely chose and followed them to the end of their campaign. When conflicts arose, they tried to resolve them, and when they couldn't, they worked separately towards the same goal. Suffragists worked every day to win equal rights for all women, particularly the basic civil right, the right to vote. And despite fierce opposition, these women never lost faith in the democratic system. They kept their eyes on the goal of political equality and by their own actions made democracy in America more real and complete. Equal suffrage exists today because of the active uprising of women and their unalterable demand to be equal partners in the American dream. This year marks the 100th anniversary of women in the United States winning the right to vote. We will join with millions of Americans telling the stories of these American women. Many whose names you already know: Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul. Some you may not yet know. But the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote gives us an excellent opportunity to honor the work of these women. In the 21st century, it's almost unimaginable to consider that there was a time when the prevailing attitude about women was that they should not vote or otherwise participate in the public arena. The story of how this change was created is a remarkable testimony to the unrelenting tenacity and spirit of women and what they can achieve in a democratic society. When we say that women won the vote, we should consider that what women really faced in the past. Then we can appreciate the remarkable courage, insight, and strength it took to accomplish what they did. Women who were seen as powerless changed America in powerful ways. To win the right to vote, women conducted a 72-year political campaign. This political campaign began at the first Women's Rights Conference at Seneca Falls in 1848 and ended with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. When threatened with physical harm, they were undeterred. In the long run, they prevailed. In the long run, hearts and minds were changed and laws, including our Constitution, were rewritten. Between 1867 and 1920, 54 electoral campaigns were organized for women's suffrage in 29 states. Women's suffrage was opposed by industries which mobilized their money, power, and influence in countless campaigns to defeat women's suffrage. Voting fraud was so widespread that politicians dismissed it with a wink and a nod. There was actually so much fraud and corruption that women began guarding the ballot boxes. Women used every opportunity to talk to men about the importance of women having the right to vote. In the West, women descended into copper and silver mines to reach miners. They spoke to small groups of rural men and women by the pale light of kerosene lamps after sundown in town after town. They traveled across the empty plains to distant settlements to reach ranchers. Women rose up in hot air balloons and flew in early airplanes to scatter rainbow-colored Votes for Women leaflets over neighborhoods and county fairs before doing so was declared illegal. They rode horses, trains, carriages, and they walked. They faced miles of hard travel in frontier America in the years before telephones, automobiles, or electricity and afterwards. They endured terrible food, contaminated water, uncomfortable beds, and often hostile audiences. In New York, women descended into subway excavations to reach immigrant laborers. They repeatedly filled the streets of the great eastern cities trying to reach male voters. Many women first marched in public during the great suffrage parades between 1910 and 1915. This was extremely controversial and was actually considered a terrible thing for a woman to do. It was seen as unwomanly and embarrassing to a man and his family for a woman to do anything so public. Yet on March 3rd, 1913, a band of suffragists in Washington, D.C. staged such a remarkable demonstration for women's rights that it has long been acknowledged as one of the high points in the 72-year drive for votes for women in the United States. By changing the focus of the larger suffrage movement from campaigns in the states to federal action on a constitutional amendment, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and their Congressional Committee of NASA led the way toward the final national enfranchisement of women. The charismatic Alice Paul was 28 years old, and her colleague, the brilliant and courageous Lucy Burns, was 33. When the line of 26 floats, 10 bands, 6 golden chariots, and divisions of between 6,000 and 10,000 women marching by country, state, profession, and occupation was blocked for over an hour by an unruly, unrestrained mob of drunken, disorderly men, the shocking views made front-page headlines nationwide. The Great Parade, a spectacle of its own, marked the opening drive in the final phase of the suffrage movement, which successfully pursued passage of the 19th Amendment, enfranchising women in every state. 4 months after the parade, the Senate issued its first favorable report in 20 years, and a renewed lobbying drive was underway, targeting congressmen and the new president. The Susan B. Anthony Amendment, finally passed Congress in 1919, was ratified by 36 states in 14 months and was declared law on August 26, 1920, a day known and celebrated as Women's Equality Day. Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of NASA, described the 3 generations of work of the women's suffrage campaign when she said, quote, "Millions of dollars were raised. Hundreds of women gave the accumulated possibilities of an entire lifetime. Thousands gave years of their lives. Hundreds of thousands gave constant interest and such aid as they could. It was a continuous, seemingly endless chain of activity. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of that chain were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended." Unquote. Susan B. Anthony was one of the suffragists who did not live to see this great victory. Yet during her last public speech on her 86th birthday, February 15, 1906, she spoke of the many women who had battled at her side, some for over half a century, for women's suffrage. Although women would not win the constitutional right to vote for another 14 years, Susan B. Anthony ended her speech with a tribute to those who work for justice, reminding us all that when people of good faith work together, failure is impossible. Anthony's famous quote resonates throughout all aspects of American society. Sitting in Applebee's restaurant about a year and a half ago with Penny, Deb, Vicki, and her daughter Rebecca, I said, I don't want the summer of 2020 to come around and we say to one another, I wish we would have done something for the Centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment. Well, our something is taken on a life of its own with a lot of help from our friends. This second Saturday celebration, the article in the Women to Women magazine, the Berks County DAR's famous lady TV about suffrage era women, plans for celebrating at the Reading Phillies Ladies' Night on June 18th, presenting this play to all of you, the gala at the Doubletree on August 26th, the Justice Bell that just arrived in our History Center here, the wonderful grant we received, Senator Schwenk's book launch, and Vicki Hefner's plan to visit Seneca Falls in May. Well, thinking about this reminded me of how Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 3 other women got together and planned the first Seneca Falls Women's Convention in 1848 to, quote, discuss social, civil, and religious conditions and rights of women, unquote. They listed grievances of which the most important and controversial was the right to vote. They had no idea how many people, or if any, would show up at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls that 19th and 20th of July, 1848. And we all know what happened after that. In high school, my history books said something like, in 1920, American women were granted the right to vote. Granted? Really? American women weren't granted anything. They had to fight to win the right to vote, as you will see from the suffragists here today, who will tell you how American women won the right to vote in our play called System Shakers and Barrier Breakers.
Today we encourage others to write the next chapter, span the ages, recall the fray.
For all of them, life was often gray.
Voices high, voices low, fostering change in the status quo.
Although too early to be labeled a suffragist, but considered a women's rights heroine, Abigail Adams was the wife of John Adams, the second president of the United States and mother of John Quincy Adams, the sixth president. She was a prolific letter writer whose correspondence reflected an intimate and vivid portrayal of her support of women's rights, including their right to vote.
We women would meet in each other's homes to quilt and talk. Often the talk was of recipes or remedies for croup and dysentery, or just droll gossip. Often I would read to them from the latest newspapers, and the conversation would change to the Congress in Philadelphia.
Is there any chance that Congress could better our lot as women and wives?
Can we get something for the ladies? Assuredly it's time.
Allow us to keep our dowries and our property, allow us to vote, and to have a voice in the church.
I would like to be allowed to make decisions about my children.
Well, it is the purpose of this Congress to pass laws, is it not?
Yes, in certain circumstances, but this Congress is concerning itself with independency and provisioning the Army. If we remain English, then we have to live under English law. If we become independent, we can make our own laws.
Oh, we must find a way to tell these men in Philadelphia what laws we women want.
I have a thought. I will write to John tonight. My dear John, I long to hear that you have declared independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than our ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power onto the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. John replied sarcastically, but I persisted. In a later letter, I complained that females were denied a voice in legislation and excluded from honors and from offices. Because John was gone from home for long periods of time, I made decisions about the management of our farm and the education of our children. I found unconventional ways to increase my family's finances, even though women could not even control their own property. Through my uncle, I invested in government securities, bought land on speculation, and started an importation business. I was always very charitable and gave my pocket money to causes which did not always meet my husband's approval. Late in life, I wrote my own will, and although it had no legal standing, John honored it. Most of my estate went to my female relatives according to their need. It gave these women and the women who followed independence.
Voices high, voices low, fostering change in the status quo.
Women of spirit, of brave word and deed, fan the flame for others to be freed.
Black women who have been activists throughout American history have fought for the rights of women and for the rights of blacks.
I was born a slave, escaped to freedom, and changed my name to Sojourner Truth after it came to me in a dream.
So christened, Sojourner traveled, sometimes alone and sometimes with others, to speak the truth on tours that would make her famous throughout the United States.
I traveled throughout Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas in the 1850s, singing gospel songs and engaging large crowds with my speeches.
Sojourner Truth had a profound impact on both the abolitionist cause and the struggle for women's rights. Her words are still powerful.
May I say a few words? I am women's rights. I have as much muscle as any man. I've done as much work as any man. I've plowed and chopped and sowed and reaped. Can a man do any more? I've heard much about the equality of the sexes. And as far as intellect, all I can say is, if a woman have a pint and a man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we take too much, for we can only take as much as our little pint will hold. men seem all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, I say, if you have women's rights, give it to her, and you'll feel better.
Even though she had never been to school, her words were persuasive.
I was born Isabella Vaughan in 1797. As a slave to a Dutch family, I hadn't been to school, of course, but as I grew older, I learned that I had the power of speech. Why, I was the first woman of color to take a white man to court and win. I did that to get my son back, who had been sold illegally into slavery to another owner. I myself escaped when I was 27 and made my way down to New York City, where I worked as a housekeeper to a Methodist man. While there, I found out about the Northampton Institute of Education and Industry up in Massachusetts. So I joined them. They believed in pacifism, women's rights, religious tolerance, and abolition of slavery. And there I met leading abolitionists of the day, such as William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Together, we toured the whole region, spreading the message. I then dictated my memoirs to my friend Olive Gilbert, which then became the basis of my book, Narrative of a Northern Slave. 8 years later, I attended the Ohio Women's Convention in Ohio, where I gave my famous Ain't I a Woman speech. In it, I argued that a colored woman like myself, who had done manual labor and born children, should be treated with the same courtesy as a white woman. Those were busy years. During the Civil War, I helped recruit Negro troops for the Union Army. I even met President Abraham Lincoln in the White House. He sat down with me and signed my Book of Life. In 1865, I rode streetcars to help force their desegregation. 5 years later, I met President Ulysses Grant and worked on his re-election campaign. At that time, the famous Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott were among my influential friends. I continued to tour and lecture well into my 70s. I was the most outspoken woman of the time who was in favor of abolition, women's rights, and prison reform at a time when neither women nor blacks dared to speak out on these topics. By the time I died, I was a celebrity. I bought my own home and published a book. I went to be at peace with the Lord at age 86 in Battle Creek, Michigan, a good and faithful servant.
Harriet Tubman was another black woman born into slavery who felt she was destined to fight this institution and to deliver her people into freedom. In justifying her work on the Underground Railroad, she ventured only where God sent her. She never accepted the false choice between civil rights for blacks and civil rights for women. She believed freedom must be taken. It cannot be granted. She believed slaves only had two choices, freedom or death. She infused in others the will to risk everything for freedom. Leading hundreds of slaves to freedom by way of the Underground Railroad, she became known to the slaves as Mother Moses, and at one time a bounty was placed on her head. After the Civil War, she supported her friends Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the early struggles for women's equality and suffrage by speaking passionately at events from Boston to Washington, D.C. After her courageous work on the Underground Railroad, she worked as a spy for the Union Army and then went north, where she was sought after by many groups to speak about her life. Even though she was legendary, she could not turn her fame into financial security. The United States Congress would not grant her petition for back salary and a pension. They finally succumbed to the pressures of public opinion in 1902 and gave her a small pension. They awarded it to her as the widow of Nelson Davis, not in her own name. They never recognized Harriet Tubman.
Voices high, voices low, fostering change in the status quo.
Women think, women speak. Women speak, keep them meek.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were two suffragists who were abolitionists. Susan B. Anthony followed in her father's abolitionist footsteps before catapulting into 59 years of speaking for women's rights. She was living calmly on her farm in New York State, so isolated that she missed the historical Seneca Falls Conference of 1848, and so missed the opportunity to help write the Declaration of Rights for Women. This began the battle for women's right to vote. 3 years later, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met at an 1851 Seneca Falls meeting.
Susan and I were quite different. Susan was Quaker and I was Protestant. Susan was single with no children and I was married with 7 children. Although vastly different, we eventually joined forces, with Susan even moving into my home. She had her own bedroom and would frequently care for my 7 children while I wrote speeches. Although a great speaker, I would not leave my children until each was at least 2 years old.
Elizabeth, you are so good. You really should get out more to speak.
Silence, Susan, or I'll have another baby. With my written words, I forged the thunderbolts that Susan fired into the world.
It was 1852, I think. You and I were delegates at the Teachers' Convention in Rochester, New York. I think there were 1,000 men and women there. And as usual, we women sat for hours while we listened to the men complain and debate. Women could not speak at public meetings.
The men are complaining about the lack of respect the public has for them as teachers. What about the lack of respect these men have for us? For the same job, women's pay was less than half that of a man's.
Susan, we've been sitting too long. This has gone on too long. I can't stand it. Mr. President!
You won't believe what followed those 2 words. If all the witches that had been drowned, burned, and hanged in the old world and the new had suddenly appeared on the platform threatening vengeance for their wrongs, the officers of that convention could not have been thrown into greater consternation. The president of the convention, a professor from West Point, marched to the edge of the platform to ask, "What does the lady want? Has the lady lost all sense of propriety?"
General pandemonium followed while the men on the platform ran back and forth, consulting with one another about the astounding development. A woman delegate did not have the right to say anything.
Half an hour of heated debate followed while Susan sat quietly waiting. When the male vote was taken, she was given permission to speak. She made them furious when she said,
Gentlemen, it seems to me that none of you quite understands the cause of the disrespect of which you complain. Now, the public sentiment holds women to be incapable of becoming acquainted with the mysteries of law, or medicine, or theology, but it is granted to her to serve the highest offices as a teacher. So long then as you, men teachers, consent to compete with women, you must be content to be considered as occupying no more than the level of her mental capacity. Is teaching a less lucrative profession, as men must compete with the cheap labor of women? Would you exalt your profession? make it more lucrative? Increase the salaries of women, as we are engaged in the noble work of educating our future presidents, senators, and congressmen.
Later in life, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton's children were older, she spoke frequently for the abolitionist cause during the Civil War and afterwards for civil rights.
As I traveled on trains, I could be found mingling with men playing cards and making friends from Maine to California. The Civil War caused a rift between the abolitionists and the women's suffrage movement. So, Susan and I combined forces again and formed the National Woman Suffrage Association in 1869.
They split from the American Woman Suffrage Association led by Lucy Stone.
I was the first president of the National Woman Suffrage Association. Among the thousands and thousands of women trained by Susan B. Anthony and inspired also, known as her suffrage daughters, the most important would be Carrie, Chapman, Catt.
Voices high, voices low, fostering change in the status quo.
Talented women working together, joining forces for the better.
I, Carrie Chapman Catt, am proud to be considered one of the most zealous and successful American leaders for women's suffrage. I grew up in the Midwest and paid my way through college because my father wouldn't pay for college for a woman. During my education at Iowa State, I joined the Crescent Literacy Society, a student organization aimed at advancing learning skills and self-confidence. Only men were allowed to speak at meetings. But I defied the rules and I spoke up during male debate. This led to a discussion and ultimately to women gaining the right to speak. I'm proud to say that in 1880, I was the only female graduating the Bachelor of Science degree. A few years later, I married Leo Chapman, a newspaper editor, and we moved to California. Leo died of typhoid fever 18 months later. So returning to Iowa, I married George Catt, a wealthy engineer. Both of my husbands encouraged my involvement in women's suffrage. I must admit that their money and encouragement made it possible for me to be on the road a good part of each year campaigning for suffrage.
Carrie began working for the National American Woman Suffrage Association, called NAWSA. Susan B. Anthony asked her to address Congress on the proposed amendment. Carrie succeeded Anthony as NAWSA president, serving 2 terms. During this time, she increased the size and influence of the organization. She supervised dozens of campaigns, mobilized numerous volunteers, and made hundreds of speeches.
My leadership was considered progressive, but not radical. Before the amendment, women could not vote for reasons which sound so unconvincing that it's hard to believe they were ever taken seriously.
People generally believed that a woman did not have enough judgment to choose a political candidate. They argued that a woman's reason was not equal to a man's. Many people have pointed out that the arguments against women's suffrage are arguments against democracy itself.
I say to you all, to the wrongs that need resistance, to the rights that need assistance, to the future in the distance. Give yourselves.
Voices high, voices low, fostering change in the status quo.
One African-American woman who worked hard to right the wrongs was Ida B. Wells Barnett.
Hello, I am Ida B. Wells. I was born in 1862 and had a reasonably happy childhood until my 16th birthday year. I lost both of my parents and my baby brother to the yellow fever epidemic, leaving me to raise 6 siblings of mine. This I did with the help of our grandmother and by teaching school. I attended Fisk University, and I started my lifelong mission of challenging where colored people stood in American society. Also, as I aged, I became understanding of the importance of media and of defiant journalism. I married Frederick L. Barnett. He was a journalist, as I was, and a civil rights activist, as I was. Between us, we had 6 children of our own, and we raised them. I became co-owner and writer for the Memphis Free Press. I loved writing, and during that time I wrote many articles which went nationwide, discussing segregation and also the horrors and the frequency of lynching. I became a target. I was bullied. I was terrorized. Finally, an angry mob came and broke into my office and smashed my presses. They also burned my office. Eventually, I moved to Chicago. And in 1913, I founded the Alpha Suffragists Club there. It quickly became the most important nationwide suffragist club for colored women in the country. In Chicago, we gained great notoriety when we helped to elect Chicago's first black alderman to city council, Oscar DePriest Sr. In doing this, we demonstrated the power that Negro women could wield when we organized behind a political cause.
Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw was a teacher, preacher, and doctor before becoming a political suffrage activist.
Although born in England and raised in Michigan and Massachusetts, I studied both theology and later medicine at Boston University. I became an outspoken advocate for women's rights politically, beginning with my affiliation with the Christian Women's Temperance Union. But my attention soon shifted to the suffrage movement when I met Susan B. Anthony, and she encouraged me to join the National Women's Suffrage Association, and together we convinced Elizabeth Cady Stanton to merge the American Women's Suffrage Association so that finally we displayed some sense of organized unity in 1890. So we formed NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. We all continued lobbying by giving speeches. Why, in fact, I gave 1,500 speeches, 15,000 speeches alone. In fact, 2 of them were here in Reading. And I fell in love with Pennsylvania, so I built a house in suburban Philadelphia in 1903, where I lived for the rest of my life. And all of us suffragists continued giving speeches and leading parades and marches across the country and even internationally, all for the suffrage cause.
In the early 1900s, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns began employing militant tactics like picketing the White House.
I'm Alice Paul, and this is my friend Lucy Burns. Lucy and I met while we were being arrested for our participation in the suffragette parade in London, England. I noticed she was wearing an American flag pin in her collar, and so we began talking about women's rights in the United Kingdom and the United States. I came back to the United States shortly after being released, and Lucy stayed till about 1912. But we had bonded immediately over our passion for women's suffrage.
I was unalterably opposed to militancy because I believed that nothing of value was ever secured by it as compared to using peaceful methods. So in 1915, I resigned from NASA as president, and I was replaced by my ally, Carrie, Chapman, and Catt. I always believed we have our principles, we have our theories, we have our beliefs, but as suffragists, we have but one belief, one theory, one principle. And that is the right of every human being to have a voice in the government under which he or she lives. On that we all could agree, if on nothing else.
Voices high, voices low, fostering change in the status quo.
Marked with sashes and banners, signs and flags afloat, Lucy Burns and Alice Paul used force to win the vote.
Alice and I met again in 1913 in Washington, D.C., and planned a massive parade the same weekend that Woodrow Wilson was being inaugurated. We wanted to let the Democratic Party in Washington know that we called them responsible if they failed to vote for women's suffrage. It was said of us that we had one spirit and one brain. Alice was the activist, and I was the diplomat.
But our parade was not without incident.
On the morning of the parade, I was told that I could not march with the Illinois delegation. It was to be a white delegation, and I was to walk at the back with the other colored people. I was insulted.
When the parade was assembling, Ida was nowhere to be found.
Yes, I decided that no one was going to keep me from marching with my delegation. So I stood on a corner waiting for the delegation to pass. And when it did, I moved in line. And 2 women from the delegation joined me, and we went arm in arm to the end of the parade.
Lucy and I formed the Congressional Union Party in 1914, which was later changed in 1916 to the National Women's Party, the NWP. In January of 1917, we picketed President Wilson's administration in Washington, D.C. Lucy and I were arrested, along with our other silent sentinels, and we were taken to the Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia. You see, many Americans felt our wartime protests were unpatriotic.
We instigated a hunger strike in the workhouse and were both force-fed. We were both in the workhouse for the night of terror during which we were beaten. My hands were tied above my head in my cell, and brutal force-feeding soon followed.
And I was deprived of sleep by an electric light that was directed at my face and turned on every hour, every night for a few seconds at a time. Well, we found a way to smuggle out information, and when confronted with the prison brutality, President Wilson sent a prison commissioner to Occoquan to check on us. He reported back to the president there was nothing wrong at the prison, and our forced feedings had been done cooperatively.
In 1918, the day before the House voted on the 19th Amendment, President Wilson came out in favor of women's suffrage. In October 1918, the amendment did not pass the Senate, but after picketing and pressure was applied directed to the politicians and the public, in June of 1919, the amendment passed the Senate by one vote, and the battle for state ratification began. By August 20th, 1920, only one vote was needed for the ratification of the amendment. That vote was cast by 24-year-old Hallie Vaughan from Tennessee. Originally, Harry intended to vote no on the women's suffrage amendment, like many politicians in the southern states, but he received a letter from his mother urging him to vote for ratification. His mother also asked him to help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification, which he did.
And 6 days later, August 26, 1920, Secretary of State Colby certified the ratification, and with the stroke of his pen, American women won the right to vote after a 72-year battle.
Yay! Ahead of their time.
Sometimes called strange. Mothers of invention,
Daughters of change.
Creating choices for tomorrow's women.
Holding them back, the chances were slim.
We salute them with honor and thanks.
They challenge us now to join their ranks.
So with voices high and voices low,
We can foster change in the status quo.
In the Toomey, the battles through the